Hello my friends and welcome to FISHTORY. I'm Alexander Williamson, your host as always, and today we're going to be talking about a lot of people's dream come true. An entire ecosystem that is self-sufficient, an aquarium that you could seal off from the world and you don't need to feed it, you don't need to do water changes, you just put a diversity of plants, a carefully selected diversity of fish, and a few microflora and fauna, and the bacteria and small microorganisms that come with all aquariums, and you set it up, you let it go, and just watch and enjoy. Well, that's the dream anyways. But realistically, it is kind of a boring thing to do. When you actually set up aquariums like that, you generally have to pick one species. So you pick some sort of small fish that's going to eat algae, for instance. And then your whole aquarium revolves around creating algae. And maybe you have a shrimp or a snail that eats the waste that the fish makes and doesn't reproduce terribly fast. And you've got one of those, orbs that they sold for a while in the late 90s and early 2000s, where they'd have the Hawaiian volcanic shrimp or something in the aquarium. Well, that is probably not what most of you want. Most of us want a nice to look at aquarium with a diversity of plants and with a diversity of fish. Now, natural aquariums mean different things to different people, but to me, a natural aquarium is an aquarium that incorporates plants and a diversity of fish, whether it's a biotope and they're all from the same place in real life and you're recreating that, or whether it's a diversity of things and you're recreating an ecosystem with different levels and different interactions of the food web. And what I want to talk about today is planted tanks that are a nice diversity of fish and plants, and all the incredible diversity you have that you may not even know about in your micro ecosystem. But beyond that, what are all the things you can put in your aquarium so that you don't need to feed it as much, so that you can have something closer to that set it and forget it aquarium? If you don't want to do as many water changes, I have videos on all sorts of different filtration and plants and substrate setups that can help get you there. But in the long run, today we're talking about specifically your biome or your food web, your trophic levels. And you start out a trophic level, of course you've got your bacteria. And regardless of if you have plants being plastic and fake and glass bottom tanks, or you have a lush tank full of 50 different species of plants and soil, you're gonna have bacteria, you're gonna have archaea, and you're gonna have some of those microorganisms, things like amoebas, things like tardigrades, things like, all sorts of little critters that are just gonna live on the surface of the water, that are gonna live on the surface of wood that you put in your aquarium, on the surface of any decoration you put in your aquarium, whether that's a nice piece of driftwood and you get a nice diversity of biofilms and what we call aufukes, or a layer of different proteins, bacterias, archaea, and microorganisms, or whether you have something simpler like your nitrifying bacteria, some carbon-eating bacteria, some, sulfur-eating bacteria. You're gonna have dozens of things in your aquarium. And today, I wanna go over the things that you can add to the aquarium to just kinda edge it along. Because otherwise, you will not get a very diverse aquarium, besides your plants and fish, which you could pay for right off the get-go. But you will not have a true food web, or you will not have a system that is feeding your fish unless you set up your aquarium with that in mind. Over time, there are little organisms, like maybe you've noticed little white dots that move around in your tank right along the substrate. And every once in a while you'll see those. Or you'll see little white dots, little white specks jumping around at the top of the aquarium. Well, those are springtails oftentimes. And where do they come from? They come in on our clothes. Where do the nitrifying bacteria come from? They come in on every surface. They float in the air. Unless you are living in a NASA-style clean room, you can't avoid them. But today we're going to overlook those things, and we can do a whole video about what it is that lives in almost every aquarium. And there are literally hundreds of species when you get down to the bacteria and the microscopic stuff and the parasites, because there are a whole host of organisms that live in every fish. Just as we have gut biomes and we have biomes and weird things like mites that live in our eyebrows and eyelashes, different little critters that eat our dead skin that we don't really want to think about usually. Well, fish have all those things, and each species usually has something unique about it as well. And so all those things come into play as well. And in this world where we're gathering things from every corner of the globe in this hobby, we also end up bringing in stuff that maybe is not so anticipated or not so great to be in there. Things like ick or worms or, tapeworms, columnaris, things like little protozoas or, harmful bacterias. And those are inevitable in our hobby as well. But if you have a wide diversity of stuff that's living in the tank, it will compete for niches in your tank. And overall, if you have a well-planted tank and you're taking good care of it, you understand the solid foundation of how your tank's set up, how you're filtering it, how your nitrates are being managed, how your nitrites, your ammonia, and all that works, then you can start thinking about a more complex system where you're having all these little critters work for you, and even having your bigger critters or your macroscopic living creatures eating your microfauna and microflora. So things like your algae then become food for the critters you wanted to keep as the main attractions. And while you could have an aquarium where you keep maybe live bears or goldfish, and they could eat duckweed all day long, and I could tell you that that's the easy setup. That's the simplest thing you can go out and do and set up and not have to even add more food to the tank, as long as you got a good enough light growing more of that duckweed or whatever it is, wolfia or water lettuce. There's all sorts of plants. And there are a number of fish that will eat plants or algae, and that's what you could do. But I want to get more in depth and talk about the little fascinating critters that live in the aquarium. And so today we're going to go over a brief list, not going into depth about where you're going to get these or their life cycles or any of that, but I have whole species spotlights on everything like brine shrimp, daphnia, like vinegar eels, like cyclops, like water beetles, like springtails and aufuchs and protein films. So we're going to go over that stuff and talk about it, but we are going to basically give you a list of things you can look into and decide, is that something I want to incorporate? And I will tell you which things, in my opinion, you should just grow as a culture that you then feed to the tank, and which things you can actually put in the tank even before the fish, and they can get a good start, and they can be food for the fish, they can be cleanup crew, and they can just be an all-around helpful additive to your ecosystem. So let's list off these things, starting from the minute and kind of covering the basic bacterial stuff like that you need for your cycle. And very quickly, we'll get to the meat and potatoes, so to speak, or the food for your fish and the mid-sized organisms that you can actually see and enjoy. All right, my friends, we need to start at the bottom. So pretend that you have a glass bottom tank, nothing in it, no substrate, well, maybe some glass beads or whatever, and no living plants, no fish even yet. If you leave that water there for a week, you will have organisms in it. And as I said, our hobby has gone out to all the different corners of the globe, and different retailers, will have something from Africa, something from India, something from South America. And all those critters, all those plants have microorganisms and sometimes eggs or young size, small size, other organisms. Sometimes microorganisms, but sometimes what we call intermediate or microfauna, microflora, and things like algae, cyanobacteria, mold spores, things like yeast that you think of, all that stuff is just floating around and will get into an aquarium even without plants or you working at it. Now, if you put plants in, you are going to increase the chances of, one, encountering those quicker, but two, also giving them a place to hide, live, and thrive. All those things, like in a plain glass tank with nothing in it but water and a filtration system, you're going to get bacteria in there as soon as you have an ammonia source. Like even just sprinkling a little bit of food or a couple leaves in that tank can jumpstart that. And as soon as that bacteria shows up, then more bacteria is going to show up. You're going to have bacteria that's eating carbon, bacteria that's eating sulfur, bacteria that's eating other bacteria. And then you're going to get archaea, and you're going to get all these other things, and all those amino acids and detritus and natural molecules and compounds, they will start to form things we call biofilms or aufukes. And even in an aquarium with no fish and no plants, you'll feel that slimy stuff. And maybe if there's decor in there, like a stick or something, you'll see a white slime or a white goo emanating from it. Well, that is a complex organism like smorgasbord. Some fish have evolved to only eat that. And things like plecos, corydoras, autocinclus, loaches, things like shrimp and snails, a lot of times that is where they get most of their protein. And so beyond just algae and things we think of that we can see easily, there are a lot of hidden things. There are a lot of creatures that are waiting for an opportunity to come forth. And this is the key part here, you guys, is there are a lot of niches in a planted tank with a diverse decor of things like rocks, wood, different species of plants. And despite the fact that, yes, they've gotten all sorts of things from around the world, and they've been in tanks perhaps with other fish, with other species of plants, and they've been in a nursery tank where there's 30 different plants all together in the store, and then they come home to you, well, any of the organisms that were at home in one of those plants or one of those tanks that store sourced it from can make it into your tank now. And so it's so important to, one, know where you're sourcing your stuff, but two, if you want a diverse ecosystem, find a good store, a quality store, and pay extra for them that do it right. The stores that quarantine and that don't just nuke all the microflora and fauna by just treating with medication a ton, and then a week later they release it. That's not the right way to go either. There's a approach in the middle where they're going to observe the fish and the plants. If they see anything off, they'll treat. And in the meantime, they're going to fatten them up and make sure they look healthy. Then they'll release them. That's what you want ideally. And that will set up your microbiome so much better than you trying to go out and go to a creek and find all the right little things. They will make their way into your aquarium without you even trying, if you just make sure that you're getting a diverse source of plants and fish. Your fish are a vector for all sorts of little critters. Things like planaria that you may wonder, where do those little worms with the triangular head, like where do they show up from? Whenever I overfeed my tank, the snails overpopulate and these little worms come out of the substrate or the bottom of the sand or the gravel. They just come up out of nowhere at night, these little tiny half-inch long worms, and soon there can be 1,000 in a matter of days just totally eating the extra food if you don't do something about it. Well, this is a niche that they're occupying. And with a bare tank, there is a big opportunity for any creature to utilize that blank slate. But when you have a tank that has all sorts of different spots, different temperatures, somewhere there's a fish that's going to eat you, somewhere there's a bacteria that's bigger than you that's going to eat you, somewhere there's a fungi that's going to break you down, and so the waste isn't going to sit there. You have all these little ecosystems within your aquarium, and things like algae, for instance, where you may think, oh, I don't want any algae in my aquarium, they become a good thing to have a diversity of. You want 20 kinds of algae that are all kind of hiding, and maybe you only see them under the microscope, but they're kind of there, and maybe they show up every once in a while on your filter or on some tubing or whatnot when you clean the glass every so often, or look in the substrate, look on the leaves of older plants. And no one takes over when there are plenty. The same is true with the microbiome. The same is true with those detritus worms and planaria, things like hydra. You know, a lot of people want to know what chemical can you add to fix it, and you're really just resetting the tank again. When you use the antibiotics or the anti-parasitical stuff on your main tank, when you don't move your fish or shrimp or snails into a treatment or hospital tank and treat them there, you are killing so much of that basic level stuff that is the main diversity in our aquariums. You literally have over 100 species of just bacteria alone, I guarantee it. In our own bodies, we have a gut biome and a whole, selection of bacteria, that the number of cells in us that are non-human, that are other species of bacteria and microorganisms, is equal to the amount of cells that are human. So, the same thing is true with your aquarium. Whatever fish you have, whatever plants you have, you need to take care of it holistically. And the things that we can put in and actually encourage, they're not that many. Really, it's setting a good groundwork. When you go out to a creek or river and you take a random sampling and you get some of that stuff, and you got a bunch of little organisms in like a resurrection jar or something, you pour that in your tank, you're going to end up selecting from one biome or 3 or 4 biomes in one lake, in one pond, wherever it is, and in the mud or in the dirt or in the lily pads, whatever it may be. And you may get a beetle or a pest that in the scale of your aquarium is a big problem. So I don't highly recommend that. What I recommend is you can do that, bring home a jar of whatever you want from your local pond and observe it, see what happens, and then selectively work with one species at a time out of there. So this is where you can find things like your Daphnia, like your seed shrimp, like your cyclops, or like little worms or little white dots that move around the aquarium, and maybe your fish are going to eat. Maybe your shrimp are going to graze on them. So that is what I would recommend in that sense. Now, there are a lot of things that I recommend feeding into the tank. And so things like brine shrimp, you can't have their ecosystem in your aquarium. You can't have brine water for most fish in the hobby, or any fish in the hobby for that matter, at the salt levels brine shrimp are at. And so we want to think of stuff that you can actually add while the fish are in there. And for that, I suggest blackworms, I suggest Daphnia, I suggest scuds or Gomeris amphipods if you're not raising shrimp and you're not trying to breed any nanofish, because scuds, or Gomeris as they're known, they are able to kill baby shrimp no problem. Planaria, they're able to kill baby shrimp no problem. And planaria sting and bite. So planaria, hydra, those are things that I wouldn't intentionally add to my tank. And honestly, you don't have to try. Those will probably end up in an aquarium, 1, 2, 3 years old. They're going to get in your aquarium no matter what, no matter how hard you try. But the things you can put in there from the start, like I said, the Gomeris, you can try Daphnia. The fish will oftentimes wipe them out, but if you give them enough hiding spots, some may survive for a time. And then also things like, normal night crawlers or red worms. You can add those as treats, but again, they're not going to live fully submerged, waterlogged probably, in your aquarium. But black worms can. So there's another great option. Mosquito larvae, that's a great thing to add, but you don't want insects hatching in your house. So add them slowly, carefully, and watch and make sure that your fish are eating them all, so you don't end up with a swarm of mosquitoes in your house and then laying more eggs in your tanks. Unless you're really hardcore, then go for it. But the other things that I would recommend are fairly limited, honestly. I think that shrimp themselves are a great resource. I think algae itself is a great resource. A lot of things eat those microbes, those biofilms, the mold, the algae, the cyanobacteria, all that kind of stuff gets eaten by a lot of the single cell organisms, and the microorganisms or microfauna and stuff that is just barely visible. It's just big enough to be visible by eyesight. Those little critters like amoebas, like tardigrades, like stentors, or any sort of pond life plankton, a lot of that stuff eats those other things that we think of as a negative in the hobby so often. And so that's why really setting up your tank to begin with And sourcing your fish and plants from a good source is really worth the money because it shows down the road for years to come. And it is its own little world. But, you know, other than the blackworms, other than seed shrimp or ostracods, Gomeris, cyclops, other than that kind of stuff that you will see in the hobby that you can add, feeding live culture foods is great. And shrimp are great. Let them have babies and some will get eaten by the fish. You know, things like duckweed, things like algae and cyanobacteria, live bearers will eat that. Your angelfish will eat that. We overfeed our fish very often. And a lot of times you just got to sit back and don't feed them for 4 or 5 days and watch what they're eating. A lot of fish will eat things that you never expected. And in the wild, you can read reports online of what they have eaten. And a lot of times what you'd expect in their stomach versus what's actually in their stomach is totally different, you know, from what we're told and what we're taught. In the hobby, you feed them flakes and things, but it may be that they're eating biofilm and slimy algae stuff for, you know, 40% of their protein. Yet for us, because of, you know, life in modern times, it's easier to give a protein source like ground up fish or ground up insects in a flake and just feed them that. Because protein is protein, right? It's not. And, you know, your fish will grow beautiful and act very differently according to where they get these things. So the closer to a natural system you can build, the more interesting it will be, in my personal opinion. The more complex things you see unfold. And you may be surprised by the organisms that do turn up. Sometimes something like an aquatic beetle or, you know, some sort of aquatic pseudo-scorpion or spider, or, you know, something that may be creepy crawly to some people, but it may be fascinating to you. And so while I wouldn't intentionally put those things in or around my aquarium, they're all things that I've seen in other folks sending me messages and things that end up part of their ecosystem, that their fish end up eating and enter the circle of life. So I hope that gives you some insight into the truth behind setting up your ecosystem. You know, we have episodes on each thing. So if you want an episode on scuds or on seed shrimp, well, I've got big, long episodes all about them and how to grow them and how to introduce them and all that kind of stuff. Same with my opinion of, you know, getting things from the wild and holding them and then putting them into your tank, or selecting some to grow as a culture and putting that into your tank later. So check out those resources, and, you know, thank you for coming by. I appreciate it so much when you guys hit that like button, or even more when you guys share. And again, I have to thank all you members. Without you, I literally can't do this. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I'll see you next time on FISHTORY.